Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Today we focus on the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Other than overthrowing Saddam Hussein, few in the world would agree that it is a legitimate war aiming at ridding the country of weapons of mass destruction. Neither was there any solid evidence that Saddam had anything to do with al-Qaeda. The presumption of guilt goes against U.S. domestic law. Looking back, how do we assess the consequences of the high-tech war and the seemingly regional equilibrium following the hanging of Saddam Hussein?
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. The tyrant has fallen, and Iraq is free.
10 years on, why did 3 of the UNP5 oppose the US-led Iraq war? What was supposed to be a quick battle had dragged on to become an 8-year conflict. What went wrong?
And it is true that much of the intelligence turned out to be wrong.
Bin Laden had initiated a crusade. But did the Iraq war open a Pandora box of civilization clashes? And smart bombs, special forces, and space dominance. Once again, the U.S. military-industrial complex has navigated a new course for low-intensity conflicts.
Today, here with me are Dr. Zhang Chunjie from Tsinghua University and Madame He Wenping from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to our program. 10 years on, how do you assess the consequences arising from the invasion?
Oh, I think the consequences is so bad. It's a tragedy, definitely. And I think the recent report I read, I think is very interesting. It has been written by a joint team. Those teams, including professor from the United States and also from other countries. So this report was finished by University of Brown. So it says it's a cost of the war. So it has given a very detail of those numbers, how many casualties has been caused. For example, it's saying the 2.2 trillion cost has been spent on this war. It's much, much higher than the Bush administration has used to be expected. And also, a lot of casualties goes to those civilians. Those people, I think, estimated 134,000 casualties goes to Iraqi civilian people. So you can see the people on the ground in the Iraq, they have suffered the most. And also, the terrorists in Iraq now has been increased dramatically. So we have seen very clear, even today, when I'm talking right here, in Iraqi, another biggest suicide bombing had been taken place and also claimed 50 people's life.
Each month, over the past few months, 300 people were killed due to sectarian violence. Dr. Zhang, what do you make of the consequences?
Well, I think this is a partial success, militarily speaking, in terms of toppling the Saddam Hussein regime. But politically, the United States definitely lost this war because of the lot of negative spillovers. It failed to find any evidence of WMDs. It failed to set up these connections between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. And, the United States has spent trillions of dollars, which arguably could have prevented probably, this economic crisis, and not to mention the casualties. Now, the most important thing is that the United States spent 10 years locally, and they just have their resources diverted from other fronts that they could use. So definitely it is, from my perspective, it is a political fiasco from all dimensions.
It is an open question as to who is the winner of the war. Let me cross over to my colleague Zhou Yue, who's on the ground talking to Iraqi people. Hello, Zhou Yue. What can you tell us about how ordinary Iraqis look at the war 10 years on?
Well, good evening, Yang Rui. First, I want to talk about the security here. It's still a big issue. Just this morning, insurgents launched deadly attacks against many areas in Baghdad, killing at least 50 people and wounding dozens, increasing sectarian tension in Iraq even a decade after the war. So victims here are just restaurant owners, laborers and bus stops in the Iraqi capital within 1 hour period. About your question, well, different people have different opinions, even in Iraq. Basically, there were more Shias supporting the war. They took the power after the U.S.-led invasion toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, where the minority Sunnis ruled over the majority Shias. You ask common Iraqis whether they want to go back to Saddam's time, few would opt for that. But the problem is this is a choice of two evils. Post-Saddam Iraq is far from an ideal place of peace and prosperity. The war 10 years ago killed hundreds of thousands of people, displacing millions more, destroying the lives of nearly half of the population. Pain and anger are still felt sharply. Most sadly, the war unleashed blood hatred that has been suppressed by an oppressor. The sectarian violence is the worst product of the war for the Iraqis, and there is no end in sight, and the people here still have to live with terror. For how long, nobody knows. Yang Rui.
After the U.S. military pulled out of Iraq, how do ordinary Iraqi people look at the military presence and what the American GIs had done to their country?
Well, Dick Cheney, the former U.S. Vice President, once said the American soldiers would be welcome as liberators in Iraq. But it turned out that the Iraqis always look at American troops as aggressors and invaders. The other thing that Americans have let down Iraqis after they occupied their country because of the many ill-advised decisions like the disbanding of the Iraqi armies and the de-Baathification that excludes the former Saddam government officials from joining the ruling class. The credibility of the government was not established, and that bred even more worse sectarian divide. On the other hand, the American military's moral authority was lost when they simply stood idle when looting happened almost everywhere in Baghdad during the first of the occupation. And what Iraqis always remember is the darkest month in 2006 when the American troops did such a poor job dealing with insurgency. Now the GIs are gone after they failed delivering on the promise of peace and stability. What they left behind is a broken country ruled by a broken government on a broken land. Now the Iraqis are on their own, but surely they have no thanks for their liberators. Yang Rui.
Perhaps the saddest story of the whole picture is their broken promise. Welcome back. That's my colleague Zhou Yue standing by in Baghdad, the heart of war-torn land. I'm afraid both of you, Madam He and Dr. Zhang, fell short of mentioning a third factor for launching the Iraqi war. That's transplantation of democracy. Do you think it's a wise idea to transplant democracy through the use of force? And do you think Arabs are ready to accept? And many American policymakers want to associate their liberation of Iraq from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein with the Arab Spring. What do you make of the association here?
Definitely, this is a very bad idea. Not mentioned is wise. Actually, it has caused a lot of chaos, like we have seen very clearly from the Iraqi during those 10 years. So, not mentioning those countries, they have a lot of different ethnic groups, like different religions, and so like in Iraqi, Sunni and Shia and Kurds. So they used to be tied together by a very strong man, that is Saddam Hussein. And but after this strong man has been topped down, and the United States they couldn't actually. I don't think they have any good idea in their pocket when they given this war. So they couldn't introduce a very good institution can bring those different sectors, different religions together. So, and also they destroyed all those institutions used to be established by the Saddam Hussein during those past long time, and they immediately dismantled all over those like police and security guards. So all of a sudden, this country becoming governor's country. So not mentioning democracy itself. Now even the security cannot be guaranteed.
Dr. Zhang, do you think what happened 10 years ago was a liberation of Iraq from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, or was it a crusade, ideologically motivated and supported by newcomers whose top representatives were Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney?
Well, I think definitely this is one of the top decisions made by the Bush team, including Cheney and Rumsfeld. But I wouldn't see it as a crusade, because this is exactly the time after 9/11, and within policymakers, top policymakers, there's a feeling that they must do something. And then it comes up with this intelligence, so-called intelligence, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. And there seemed to be a consensus in Washington, D.C. Everybody believed that, even Democrats. Here is a check and a balance. This is a system, political system, that failed to accomplish the differences between parties. But for the first time in history, we see so much consensus here, believing the existence of WMD. So I wouldn't call it a crusade. It is more or less a wrong political decision made by the Bush team.
Thank you very much. Let's cross over to my colleague Tony, who's standing by in Baghdad, in some part of Iraq as well. Now, Tony, after the fall of Saddam Hussein and the establishment of a Shiite majority elected government, the heart of the country is still trapped in ethnic and sectarian violence, vicious political factionalism and foreign meddling. Since mid-December, mass protests in the style of the Arab Spring took place in Sunni majority provinces to the north and west of Baghdad. Do you think the rise of jihadist Sunni groups was something that the U.S. hadn't anticipated?
I don't think they had. I think it was a big problem. I'm in Basra, by the way, in the south, and this is a very Shia-dominated area, which hasn't seen a lot of the sectarian violence that we've seen in the rest of Iraq, and has remained relatively settled for the last couple of years. Nonetheless, I think when the Americans came in here, and this is where they started to approach exactly 10 years ago, I don't think they'd thought very carefully about the religious makeup of Iraq. Certainly when they arrived, there's the suggestion that the Americans encouraged certain Shia militias, and that encouraged a response from the Sunni militias. Also, I think, speaking to many Iraqis, no one even here had imagined that al-Qaeda operatives would be flooding in from all over the Middle East. And I think once the American presence here was established, there was suddenly a cause célèbre for those al-Qaeda operators to find willing fighters on the ground, both Iraqi and from outside. Now, Iraqis, some in the Iraqi government say that one of the reasons that the last couple of years have been a little bit more settled is because those al-Qaeda operatives have moved on into Syria. But I think they're still very concerned for the potential for violence and sectarian violence here all across Iraq.
People in the more prosperous Shia-dominated southern part of Baghdad enjoy a fair and rising prosperity due to the oil-rich wealth. However, they are also alarmed by the sight of Ba'athist slogans and jihadist banners in the Sunni protests. Do you think the current sectarian violence is likely to slide into anarchical civil strife?
I think many people here in Iraq, on both sides of the religious divide, Shia and Sunni, understand that if Iraq is going to move on, it needs to find some kind of stability. And actually, since 2007, that has started to happen. There are still protests up in the north of Iraq. The Sunni minority do feel very much discriminated from, and I think the Shia-dominated government haven't done everything they could to bring the Sunnis back into the fold. I think there is a certain amount of external pressure for them to try and do so. Certainly some of the Gulf states, I think, are hopeful that Iraq's government will be more accommodating of the Sunnis. We haven't seen that so far, but there are elections due next year, a general election all across the country. And I think everyone here in Iraq realizes that if the country is to advance, it needs to find a bit of breathing space to let the basic work of reconstruction start. And if you think, since the invasion 10 years ago, very little has changed in many of Iraq's cities. Even in Baghdad, the capital, where you still see raw sewage flowing onto the streets, and most people still only have electricity for 4 hours of the day. So I think ordinary Iraqis want that to happen. Obviously, there are elements in power and radical elements as well who have vested interests in seeing the violence continue. But if you speak to an ordinary Iraqi on the street, regardless of their religious background, I think they want to see some kind of peace return.
Thank you very much. That's Tony Chang, standing by in Basra, a port city in southern Iraq. Thank you for being with us. Welcome back. What do you think of the post-war reconstruction? Prime Minister Maliki has been accused of abusing his power in marginalizing the Sunnis, particularly the Ba'athist party, the ruling party during the Saddam era. What do you think of the efforts by the the Shiite majority government?
Well, as you said, Maliki's government has been even has been named as the third worst, corruptive regime right now in the world. So there are lots of bad story going on about this government's lacks of transparency, so on and so forth. So that's why those post-conflict reconstruction has been taken place in a very troublesome way. So I think because this Shia government, they are minority in terms of the population of the people.
Shiite, majority or minority?
Shia is
Sunni.
minority. And the Sunni is the majority. So Sunni is the majority. But the Shia, Maliki government, they, especially in the Kurds, in the north, that's the oil-rich area. So oil-rich area people, they want to get more share of their oil income. But for the south and for the west and the central, so those Sunni, and they think they haven't benefited quite a lot from those oil export. So those interests of the oil sharements also caused another block for the post-construction.
What do you make of, Dr. Zhang, what do you make of the virtually independent Kurdish statehood? I mean, during the Saddam dictatorship, they were ruthlessly prosecuted, ruthlessly depressed. What do you think of the current efforts at national reconciliation between the three major tribes?
I think it totally depends on the broader political framework that these different sections are going to work out in the near future, and whether they accept the democratic practice of making compromises and concessions to other sides. And on that topic, I think this is exactly the question that you asked previously about this, the thing about transplanting democracy to Iraq. And time again, history has proved there's no use to impose your values and political institutions without considering the local situations, politics, religions, and the sectarian conflicts. And when you wipe out all these institutions back in the Saddam Hussein period, then there is this major shakeup in the political system, and these sides, they have to work with each other, and assuming that they can work, we'll sit down and then talk about it. And then there's going to be I think there's going to be a long process before they can work out some rules to play with each other without turning to violence.
Do you think this is a war at terror, or it's a campaign to transplant democracy? In Afghanistan, right after September 11th terrorist attacks, NATO showed their support for the military operations against the Taliban. However, in Iraq, the picture was very different. Gerhard Schröder, the former German chancellor, and the French president Jacques Chirac were both opposed to the invasion itself.
Well, I think you just mentioned two official excuses of the Bush team to wage this war. One is democracy, expand democracy, but I never buy that argument in any decisions regarding war, because this is something that politicians want to add to the list of excuses they're looking for before they start a war. The second about this terrorism, if you look back how it went, through these 10 years, it was quite counterintuitive. It was quite counterproductive. If you really believe this is a war against the terrorism, then the end result is it will bring about more terrorism from three perspectives. One is that during the 10 years of war, you have a lot of orphans and teenagers and young people. They are actually, after the war construction, they are attracted to terrorist branches in that area. And the second reason is that you have a very weak state, very lacking legitimacy among these different political sectarians. And that, again, that reduced the capacity of the government to combat terrorism. And the third thing is that probably the war in Iraq created a black hole in the Middle East, where since then, if ever you find a hot spot, and that hot spot will become a black hole, sucking in all terrorist branches locally from elsewhere. So from these three perspectives, this is definitely counterproductive to counter-terrorism efforts.
Do you think some kind of agreement must have been reached between Baghdad and the Kurds in the north of Iraq that high degree of autonomy could be allowed for, and therefore in the long distance, in the remote future, there is the strong possibility that an independent Kurdistan would be established, quite to the dismay of the neighboring Turkish government?
Well, I think it is very likely because during the Saddam Hussein's ruling time, the Kurds in the north, they have been, suppressed very much. So that's why they are fighting for top down the Saddam Hussein. So right now, I think, relatively speaking, those people living in the north, that the Kurdish people, they enjoyed better of time. Comparing with the rest of other population in the rest part of Iraqi. So because comparing with the past, their life in the Saddam Hussein's time, they think now they finally no longer be so marginalized, so they can enjoy the farming in a free way. So I think it's very likely maybe Maliki government, if they want to stabilize the Iraqi country in a whole, maybe they will share some power or give some highest autonomy first to the Kurdish people in the north.
What do you think of the growing Iranian influence in Iraq because of the Shia majority there?
That's actually a very good question. If you look at this problem, the Iraq war, geographically, it doesn't make any sense for the United States government because for decades after the late 1970s, the priority threat, the primary threat in this region to U.S. and its allies is Iran. And U.S. considers Iran its first enemy in the region. And once you started this Iraq war, the political situation, domestic situation has not stabilized, and Iraq just ceased to be a counter to Iran. And that actually, in some way, will compromise the interests, the security interests of the United States in this region and its allies too. So that's a geopolitical story that doesn't make any sense for this decision. That's why I call it a wrong decision from most of these dimensions.
And during the Iran-Iraq war, who supported Saddam Hussein and provided him with the chemical weapons?
So that's exactly goes to the opposite wish of the United States, because they used to want to diminish the influence of the Iran. But we all see very clearly after the Iraqi war, now the Iran and the Iraqi, they have been tied together much closer than before, and even together with the Syria government right now on the power, because they all belong to the Shia sector. So I think. Also, the terrorist activity also goes to another opposite wishes of the United States, because this war is in the name of anti-terror and also in the name of democracy and freedom, but eventually we see many terrorist activities.
The Bush administration may have made a stupid and expensive mistake by toppling Saddam Hussein, a hedge against the growing influence of the Persian state. Now, yet another mistake could possibly be made in Syria, where a hostile Sunni majority government is likely to be set up following the possible fall of Assad. What do you think of that haunting specter for the U.S.?
I think when we talk about this Iraqi war 10 years on, I think this should be another early warning things for those decision makers sitting in the White House or sitting in the Paris or whatever, Downing number 10 Downing Street. So for them, because we all know the Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of the UK, and also the Junior Bush, when they made this decision to top down the Saddam Hussein regime, they haven't think about how will be the post of this strongman, how will be those following disasters. So they just destroy and never think about how to reconstruct this society. So I think they need a second thought, how to deal with the Syria issue right now.
By the end of the day, a majority of those who follow the situation in Iraq and indeed the broad region of the Middle East came to the conclusion that it's the new ideology, the new cons and bilateral or unilateral strikes, preemptive strikes that should take the blame. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. Tomorrow we'll continue discussing the post-war reconstruction in Iraq and the regional consequences. And see you next time. Bye for now.
Bin Laden had initiated a crusade. But did the Iraq War open a Pandora box of civilization clashes? And smart bombs, special forces, and space dominance. Once again, the U.S. military-industrial complex has navigated a new course for low-intensity conflicts.
Today, here with me are Dr. Zhang Chunjie from Tsinghua University and Madame He Wenping from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to our program. 10 years on, how do you assess the consequences arising from the consequences of the high-tech war and the seemingly regional equilibrium following the hanging of Saddam Hussein?
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. The tyrant has fallen, and Iraq is free.
10 years on, why did 3 of the UNP5 oppose the US-led Iraq war? What was supposed to be a quick battle had dragged on to become an 8-year conflict. What went wrong?
And it is true that much of the intelligence turned out to be wrong.
As expected. And also, a lot of casualties goes to those civilians. Those people, I think, estimated 134,000 casualties goes to Iraqi civilian people. So you can see the people on the ground in the Iraq, they have suffered the most. And also, the terrorists in Iraq now has been increased dramatically. So we have seen very clear, even today, when I'm talking right here, in Iraqi, another biggest suicide bombing had been taken place and also claimed 50 people's life.
Each month, over the past few months, 3 of the invasion.
Oh, I think the consequences is so bad. It's a tragedy, definitely. And I think the recent report I read, I think is very interesting. It has been written by a joint team. Those teams, including professor from the United States and also from other countries. So this report was finished by University of Brown. So it says it's a cost of the war. So it has given a very detail of those numbers, how many casualties has been caused. For example, it's saying the 2.2 trillion cost has been spent on this war. It's much, much higher than the Bush administration has used to be.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Today we focus on the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Other than overthrowing Saddam Hussein, few in the world would agree that it is a legitimate war aiming at ridding the country of weapons of mass destruction. Neither was there any solid evidence that Saddam had anything to do with Al-Qaeda. The presumption of guilt goes against U.S. domestic law. Looking back, how do we assess